First published in 1986, The Hellbound Heart is a significant work in the career of Clive Barker. In the book, the combination of dark fantasy and suburban terror provides a kind of thematic bridge between the grisly horrors of Barker's celebrated short story collections, the Books of Blood, first published to enormous acclaim between 1984 and 1985, and the more expansive multi-layered dreamscapes of novels like Weaveworld from 1987 and The Great and Secret Show from 1989. Though comparatively slim at 186 pages, The Hellbound Heart is perhaps the perfect introduction to Barker's work. Not only is it a good example of his Baroque literary style, as well as his innate ability to find the grotesque and otherworldly in the mundane and sometimes brutal realities of the everyday, but it also introduces and expands upon many of the key themes and obsessions that run throughout the author's career. Themes like the corruption of innocence, forbidden desires, the transformation of the flesh through the pursuit of pain as pleasure, as well as the very Lovecraftian suggestion of ancient worlds and traditions existing within the shadows of our own. In The Hellbound Heart, Julia, a bored housewife, is caught between the rivalries of two brothers. Rory, a reliable if uninteresting husband, and Frank, the embodiment of a far more dangerous and predatory sexuality. The overall story could very easily have played out as a melodrama of suburban infidelity, something capturing the same now dated zeitgeist as a film like Fatal Attraction from 1987, where the extramarital affair at the centre of the story becomes an allegory for the then contemporary crisis facing the conservative family unit. With Barker, however, this already familiar trope is transformed through the author's dark imagination, turning the dysfunctional family dynamics of his characters and the banal soap opera conventions of the love triangle into something more disturbing and transgressive. The combination of influences, including the surface of a more conventional old dark house mystery, with elements of sadomasochistic body horror and domestic parody, feels both clever and somewhat unique. Barker takes a story that seems at first grounded, intimate, and remarkably small scale in its focus on cramped suburban spaces and genial cuckoldry. The author then deconstructs this outline of drab domesticity through appeals to the depressing true-life horrors of criminals like John Christie and Dennis Nilsen. Monsters who, like the characters of The Hellbound Heart, would lure unsuspecting victims back to their places of residence and dispatch them in brutal, terrifying ways. Like the crimes of Christie and Nilsen, horror for Barker is often about peeling back the layers of something that seems, on the surface, entirely mundane, only to then find the creeping darkness and elemental evils lurking within. Characters going about their daily lives might appear, from first impression, to be respectable, well-adjusted, even attractive. But when we scratch away that carefully curated facade, such characters are often revealed to be greater monsters than even Dracula or the Wolfman. There's also Barker's clever use of setting, taking the image of the suburban family home, a familiar icon from countless wholesome sitcoms and TV dramas, and contrasting it with the old dark house archetype of countless works of gothic horror fiction. At the same time, debasing and degrading that initial image by imposing upon drab, aspirational, clean-cut suburbia a kind of medieval brutality, where the family home becomes a charnel house. Building on a foundation of H.P. Lovecraft's cosmic terror and the gothic confessionals of Edgar Allan Poe, the introduction of eroticism or perversion into this more characteristic horror story feels like an innovation. In contrast to much of the horror fiction of the period, where sexuality was often coded as impurity and as such punishable by death. See John Carpenter's landmark teen slasher film Halloween from 1978, or the arguably homophobic A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge from 1985, as two notable examples of mainstream horror's strain of sexual panic. The characters of The Hellbound Heart aren't punished for their sexual perversions or desires. Instead, they're given the opportunity to indulge, engorging themselves on a great banquet of carnalities to the delight of the dark gods they've summoned from unknown worlds. Like the character Simon McNeill from Barker's earlier short story, The Book of Blood, the protagonists of The Hellbound Heart are not judged for their earthly actions, but instead are punished for attempting to cheat their supernatural hosts. It's only when humanity attempts to assert its own superiority over those ancient forces that our characters consign themselves to their own destruction, a destruction that takes cruelty and damnation to new and unsettling extremes. And extremes really is a key word when approaching the book in question. In The Hellbound Heart, Frank, having exhausted the limits of earthly pleasure, solves a strange puzzle box that opens a doorway to another dimension. Here he encounters the Order of the Gash, the Cenobites, who offer pleasures of the flesh that transcend human comprehension. However, as in all Faustian tales of the damned, the transcendence offered by the Cenobites carries a terrible cost. Frank's body is literally torn apart, his soul trapped between worlds. When Julia discovers that a remnant of Frank has returned, she becomes complicit in his resurrection, becoming the characteristic femme fatale as she lures innocent victims to the old dark house she calls home, and killing them in a pitiless fashion. This collision between sex and death, desire and deception, as well as the literal commingling of flesh against putrefying flesh, are further refinements of the recurring themes and imagery of Barker's earlier works. What often elevates Barker's stories beyond the boldness of his imagination is the richness of his language. While I think some accusations of pretension could occasionally be levelled at Barker's work, what with its florid descriptions and often fervent tone, I think his writing comes from a place of seeing horror as an already elevated art form, and as such aspiring to tell the kinds of lurid, grotesque, somewhat salacious horror stories that are so often diminished or dismissed by mainstream readers and critics in a voice much closer to that of the classical prose stylists. His descriptions here disarm and disturb the reader through layers of sensory detail, the terror and disquiet evoked by lengthy descriptions of sight, sound, smell, and taste. Few horror writers of his generation match this same combination of literary aspiration and twisted imagination. More so than his peers, perhaps, Barker's vocabulary is ambitious. His horror feels separate to the work of talented contemporaries like James Herbert, Dean Koontz, Graham Masterton, even Stephen King, instead flaunting pretensions to the transgressive intellectualism of the Marquis de Sade, Edgar Allan Poe, or George Bataille. Those same transgressions and provocations of the flesh brought kicking and screaming into the 1980s, and into the age of the video nasty. Elsewhere, his fantasy strives for the feel of Jean Cocteau, another artist who sent his characters on dark journeys into subterranean realms, and who often found worlds existing in parallel with our own. Like much of Barker's fiction, The Hellbound Heart is about characters testing the limitations of their own sense of self, as well as the boundaries between the world of the living and the world of something altogether more primal or surreal. In many of his stories, his characters seek pleasures beyond the flesh, and knowledge beyond our own earthly comprehension. In doing so, they find themselves transformed. While it is excessive and grotesque, the violence and brutality of these transformations never feels gratuitous, perhaps because we, like the characters in his stories, are seeking extreme experiences of our own, testing our own limits as we plumb the depths of depravity, searching out new horrors that make the quotidian fears of our everyday world pale into insignificance. But it's not just the violence and cosmic reckoning of the book that benefits from the author's distinct talents. The atmosphere that he evokes throughout, situating these otherworldly horrors against a backdrop that is recognisably grounded and real, is always palpable. As a writer, he's able to introduce backstories and world building in a way that sits comfortably within the immediate story, never feeling unearned or expositional, but always adding depth and colour to the surrounding narrative. There's a sense throughout that Barker is in complete control of his craft. Whether it's in describing Frank's initial exile and his encounter with the Le Marchand configuration, the strange puzzle box that supposedly offers great wonders to those able to unlock its hidden mysteries, or in describing Julia's joyless seductions of a succession of unpleasant male suitors in her efforts to restore Frank to the land of the living, the book is always vivid and visual in its storytelling and themes. Another factor that makes The Hellbound Heart an important work for Barker is its basis as the source material for the author's 1987 film Hellraiser. Barker had experimented with filmmaking throughout the 1970s, producing short avant-garde films, such as the 1973 Oscar Wilde adaptation Salome and the 1978 work The Forbidden, the title of which would later be repurposed for a short story in the Books of Blood, which in turn would inspire the film Candyman from 1992. After being disappointed with the film adaptations of his screenplays for Underworld from 1985 and Rawhead Rex from 1986, Barker decided that any future adaptations of his work would require a more hands-on approach, making Hellraiser, an adaptation of the book in question, his feature-length directorial debut. Hellraiser would go on to become a significant box office hit, grossing $30 million against a $1 million budget, and launching a lucrative franchise that endures to this day. The critical and commercial success of Hellraiser would further cement Barker's reputation as one of the key figures in 1980s horror, with the image of the book's interdimensional antagonist, the Hell Priest, affectionately termed Pinhead, becoming a genuine icon of the genre. As an adaptation, Hellraiser remains mostly quite faithful to the source. The themes and general storytelling beats remain the same, and the progression of scenes is almost verbatim to that of the original text. Surprisingly, however, I think the film improves on the book in one hugely significant way. In the book, Kirsty, our sort of heroine, is introduced as a close friend of Rory, Julia's cuckolded husband. There's an implication here that Kirsty carries a torch for Rory, and as Julia starts to bring strange men back to the house, behaving in a more than suspicious manner, Kirsty's concern for Rory leads her into the orbit of the dangerous Frank. In this presentation of the character, Kirsty lacks any plausible motivation. She's more of a plot device than a conventional protagonist, her interjections into the story feeling more like narrative contrivances than realistic behaviour. In the film, Barker changes the dynamic between the characters significantly. Rory, renamed Larry in the film, is presented as an older character. Julia is his second wife, while Kirsty is rewritten to be Larry's teenage daughter. This brings a much greater complexity to the domestic aspect of the story, introducing a necessary animosity between Kirsty and her glamorous stepmother Julia, as well as adding a more disturbing Freudian element to the story once the still predatory Frank takes on the form of Larry and his place at the head of the family. In the book, Frank's line "come to daddy" is a throwaway one-liner. However, in the film, with Frank now literally wearing the skin of Kirsty's actual father, it's transformed into something grotesque and genuinely perverted. Similarly, the film's relationship between Kirsty and Julia introduces a kind of wicked stepmother arc, which suggests further references and connotations to classic folk tales and fairy stories, such as Snow White and Cinderella. Kirsty, as presented in the Hellbound Heart, is a still capable protagonist. She feels comparable perhaps to the heroine of some old gothic mystery novel from the 1960s. The kind of character we'd expect to see standing pensive on a windswept moor, or fleeing an old dark chateau in a billowing white gown, naive, innocent, stumbling into a dangerous situation for the man she loves but can never possess. I also thought of certain female characters from the films of Alfred Hitchcock. In Kirsty's investigations, we might think of Grace Kelly in the masterpiece Rear Window from 1954, as Kelly's character Lisa takes on the role of the amateur sleuth to find dirt on a neighbour who may or may not have murdered his wife. We might also think of Teresa Wright in Shadow of a Doubt from 1943, as her character Charlie slowly theorises that her favourite uncle might be a dangerous criminal. We might also argue that Kirsty's chaste, comparatively innocent love for Rory, which manifests in this attempt to save him from the dark clutches of his brother, provides a moral counterpoint to the perverse, predatory relationship between Frank and Julia. An interesting parallel, and one that again connects back to the iconography of those classic fairy stories, which often present opposing forces of light and dark as shorthand for the battle of good against evil. While the book is infamous for its grisly violence and disturbing scenes of supernatural reckoning, The Hellbound Heart isn't without humour. There's a dark irony to Barker's subversion of this domestic drama through the intrusion of almost Lovecraftian elements, where the relationship between his characters feels almost playfully absurd in this gruesome, otherworldly context. The self-contained setting of the house also gives the story a claustrophobic, almost liminal quality, with the slow disintegration of Rory and Julia's marriage unfolding beneath the watchful gaze of the undead Frank. As Kirsty is drawn into this unfolding mystery, and forced into that role of amateur sleuth, the tension of the story becomes palpable, making the mood and atmosphere of the setting every bit as compelling as the horrors that inhabit its disarmingly mundane form. While The Hellbound Heart is more modest in comparison to Barker's later dark fantasy epics, its conciseness, combined with the smaller cast of characters, make it one of the more accessible entry points into the author's work. The story is a great showcase of Barker's visual imagination and recurring themes, in particular, the link between desire and damnation. The heart wants what it wants, and every character here is a hostage to their emotions. Kirsty desires Rory, Rory desires Julia, Julia desires Frank, and Frank desires power and pleasure beyond mortal comprehension. These desires drive the story inexorably towards its nightmarish conclusion, one that gives literal form to the old saying that every family has a skeleton in the closet. If you've read The Hellbound Heart, or if you've seen the film Hellraiser, then I'd love to hear your thoughts on either of these works in the comments. I'm currently working my way through the stories from the first volume of Barker's short story collection, The Books of Blood, with a video on the third story, The Yattering and Jack, hopefully finished very soon. So if you enjoyed this video, that might be something to keep an eye out for. Until next time, thanks for watching.